Welcome back. In this section, we're concerned with map entrances. Really, map entrances and map exits are the same thing because they take you somewhere else, some other map. What I'm interested in is creating some kind of actor that once we reach it, it'll take us into another map. Now, this is going to involve several different things, but the most basic of these things is I'd like to know when we're highlighting a certain actor. If I hover over a map entrance, I want to see it highlighted. It would be nice if we could highlight dungeon entrances the same way we could highlight enemies. Now, if I highlight an enemy, then it becomes red. But if I highlight, say, a dungeon entrance or another map entrance, I want to highlight it, but not red. I like it to be a different color. So how do we get this functionality, this highlighting, but different colors depending on what we're highlighting? Well, first we have to go to the material that's giving us this highlight effect. That's our post-process material that we have in our post-process volume. If we select our post-process volume and in the details panel search for material, here's the array of post-process materials used in this post-process volume. And if we browse to PP highlight, here is our post-process material that's giving us the highlight effect. Now, we don't have to understand all of the inner workings of this material. As you can see, there's kind of a lot going on here. The important part is right here, where we have these colors. Now, we're only using red, and for that reason, this material only has the ability to highlight red. And it's highlighting something if that particular thing is using the custom depth stencil render pass, and if that thing has its custom stencil value set to 250. Now, this system takes in the scene and checks out the scene's custom stencil values, and anywhere in the scene where a given texel is using the custom depth render pass, that texel, think of texels as pixels in material space, has a numerical value. So we're getting that numerical value here. And for the surrounding texels of the enemy, as long as it's rendering to custom depth stencil, then these texels around the enemy have the value of 250. Now, let's just say that this wire here carries that value of 250. It passes it into an if node. If takes in two inputs, A and B, scalar values, and if A is 250 and B is 250, then we have three other nodes here that determine what gets returned from this if based on A and B's values compared to each other. If A is greater than B, if A is equal to B, and if A is less than B, all give the same output here. And that output is what we have passed into these pins, which is the color red. So we can change this to be more conditional based on that custom depth stencil value. So let's just say we'd like to have a different color if we're using the custom depth stencil value 251, for instance. Well, if the value that we're checking here, A, is greater than 250, we should have a different color passed in. We could pass in, say, one of these other colors right into A is greater than B. So let's do that for a second. Let's take this blue color here and take its value and plug it in right here to the if for A is greater than B. What happens when we do that? Well, if we apply this material and we come back into the scene and select our goblin, for instance, we can take this goblin and select its mesh in the details panel. Here it is. And for its mesh, I can search for custom depth. And here we have render custom depth pass. Remember, we enable or disable this to allow something to be highlighted. If I enable it and change custom depth stencil value, first of all, before I change it, notice that it's highlighted red, right? And that's because this if says if this value here is either equal to B, which is 250, return red, but also if it's less than B, return red. Well, 0 is the value. See, custom depth stencil value 0, that's less than B, so we get red. But now let's try putting in 251. Oh, and I it worked, but I was actually selecting this ground tile here. Notice the ground tile is now outlined in blue. So I'm going to have to uncheck that for the ground tile and select the enemy. And with the enemy's mesh selected, now I can enter 251. And now we see that the enemy is highlighted blue. So now we have the capability of highlighting things blue if their custom depth stencil value is 251. Well, let's say we'd like more colors than that. Well, we have this other if here, and this other if is checking that custom depth stencil value against 251. And it has a case for when A is greater than B. So if we have a value greater than 251, we're passing in something else. If it's equal to 251, we're passing in the color blue. And if it's less than 251, we're passing in the color blue. So what happens if we take this, which could potentially be blue, and hook this into A is greater than B here? Well, now we have the capability of red for 250 and blue for 251. If we apply this and take our goblin with its mesh selected and change it back to 250, we get red. And changing it to 251, we get blue. Now, going back to this material, what we have for A is greater than B is an if. And this if checks the value against 251. If it's equal or less, then we get blue. But if it's greater, we get the result of this other if here, which is checking the value against 252. And if it's greater than or equal to 252, we get tan. So for that reason, if we take our goblin and select its mesh and set the custom depth stencil value to 252, well, now we get this tan color. So we have 3 custom depth stencil values, 250, which corresponds to red, 251, which corresponds to blue, and 252, which corresponds to tan. So now that we've enhanced or upgraded this post-process highlight material, we can now use blue and tan for anything we like. So this is pretty cool. And remember that in our IDE, we went into aura.h, our project header file, and we defined custom depth red to be 250. We can also define our blue and tan as well, and I'd like to do that. I'd like to define custom depth blue as 251 and define custom depth tan as 250. And now with this, we can set the custom depth stencil values to anything, to 251 or 250, as long as we enable that custom depth stencil pass, render custom depth stencil pass, that's right here. And by the way, I've mentioned this when we first did this highlight material way back at the beginning of the course. That's quite a long time ago. So I'm going to refresh your memory on something we had to do to make this all work, because you may add this to another project, and it's not going to work unless you go into project settings and you search for custom depth, and you make sure that custom depth stencil pass is enabled with stencil, not just enabled. By default, it just says enabled. So you might check this and see enabled and think, well, we can use the custom depth stencil. Well, we have to use custom depth stencil pass, which means we need this enabled with stencil to use this feature. So make sure that that is set there. Otherwise, you'll be very frustrated and not know why this isn't working for you. Okay, so this is great. Now, I can leave this as tan. It doesn't matter, because if I come back and hover over the enemy, it'll set this back to red. And in addition to that, if I unhighlight, it sets that render custom depth pass boolean back to false, so we're not actually rendering it anymore. And this comes back to what we're doing when we cursor trace. Now, I'd like to be able to cursor trace over multiple types of objects, not just enemies. And I'd like to be able to highlight multiple things. Now, our highlight code is an interface function. We have an highlight and an unhighlight interface function, and we put that in the combat interface because thus far we've only needed to highlight enemies. But now we need to highlight non-enemies. And for that reason, I'd like to make a new interface, a highlight interface, specific to highlighting that we can add to any actor and give it the ability to highlight. So for that reason, we're going to make a new interface, and we're going to do that in the next video. I'll see you soon.